Thank you. Okay, I'll answer the question that I know you're all dying to ask. Yes, I am a feminist. That's right. Any other questions? Yes.
What's your writing routine?
What is my writing routine? Oh, I get up very early, usually between 5:10 and 5:20. I go work out or go to the gym, go hiking, do something, have a very healthy breakfast, and then I work for about 10 or 12 hours a day. And I usually do that about 6 times a week. This project actually is kind of exciting for me because it now requires others. And so there is this informal collection known as Atelier Z, and it involves graphic artists and researchers and translators. And so that 12-hour day is also broken up by me, meeting with some of these people and discussing how we're going to, further develop a certain graphic component to the book. Because I guess that's one thing I haven't shown. Is the book has many elements in how it's laid out. So a lot of the play for me is how this a kind of image and a series of words can bring to light kind of a new meaning, or sort of a new experience. So this is a little story about an owl at the very end of the book, and you can see not only does it look like an owl, but it's also constructed out of all of these phrases that you've become familiar with over the course of reading that story in the book. So there's a lot of that. And then I try to have a healthy meal and maybe watch a little mindless television, do some reading. Oh, I should add, actually, right after I have breakfast, I read for at least an hour. I make a point of reading, because that's, obviously, it's crucial. Yes?
Speaking of graphics, it's probably one of my favorite parts of your books is they require you to be so active in the way that they're set up. And so when I look at your books, I'm constantly looking at the tiny little details. I love it. It's like a treasure hunt. I love it. So when I picked up the Familiar, the first thing I noticed was the cover has all these little tiny pink cats, except for one over toward the left, and it's gray.
Oh, you're going to love this book. This book was written for you.
Is there a secret to the gray kitten?
She wants to know the secret already. She's noticed that there are little details in the cover, and one of those details is that one of the cats is, the thing looks like wallpaper. Like, some people don't even notice that it's made out of cats. And then you look closer and you see that it's cats, and then you see that one is gray. And I don't know, we'll have to see. There will be many answers in the books to come. Yes. It's very good. Love that. We're connecting the dots right now. We can do this. Yes.
Do you know how the entire series ends, or are you just going to discover it?
Great question. Do I know how it's going to end? Do I know what's going to happen on the 27th volume? Yes. I spent 9 years working on this. I've written 10 volumes. I've mapped out many times the entire structure, the act sequence, just like a television writer would in some ways. And then in the course of doing that, I also began to figure out how to write the book. And so by the 10th volume, so for young writers, bear that in mind, I had to write 10 volumes to figure out how to write volume 1. And now I'm in the process of rewriting all of them. So all of the characters in the book, all of their destinies, I own. However, I promise you that should this in fact work and reach its conclusion, it will be completely different from everything that I've planned out. There is no way that over the course of those many years, things aren't going to change. Even the small little details begin to have this cumulative effect. So that one little gray, kitten on the cover exerts a certain amount of influence. And so for me to pretend to say that I could really, I mean, sure, I could force the ending, but then that would be untrue to everything that came before. And so things already are beginning to shift. Already as I'm traveling around on this tour and meeting new people and hearing little stories, I see how little things can change, and those changes will generate larger and larger shifts in the future. So I own nothing. Yes?
So, based on how artistic your books are, it seems like the materiality of the book is so important, especially the way you have your form mirroring your content. But then I know you're also a person of the internet. You have an XKCD comic in here that I noticed. So I'm curious about what you think about ebooks, and especially how your books could translate to that.
So the question is, basically because of the amount of artistic work that goes into the book itself, whether it's the design on the page or actually the selection of paper, which was a big deal, and and how those colors are going to read on that paper. What do I think of ebooks? Well, to be done correctly, I think it's a new profession. We did release the 50-Year Sword as an ebook, and there were some animations and some music, but it was an enormous amount of work, of exploration, and I suddenly began to see that there could be a career out there for someone who is devoted to understanding how this medium can work and how books can in some ways be translated into that form. That said, the publisher understands that they have to get out an e-version. And I've heard reports that the e-version of this is very successful on the iPad. And some of the early reviews on Amazon were all 1 star purely because it was the Kindle version, which apparently was not a very friendly experience. So, but I feel for them. They work very hard. There's so many platforms. There's so many different, pluses and minuses when it comes to kind of programming you're allowed to do, and at least in this way we're dealing with one form. And actually that was another big question, because in the past I've done multiple versions of the book. There's hardcovers and paperbacks and different kinds of colored editions and whatnot. And for this one, because it was so immense, we just decided to stick with one form. It will always be in this shape. Well, always. Who knows? Yes.
I was wondering, whenever you're, especially with House of Leaves, whenever you have all these hidden messages and, layers and layers of detail, how do you go about writing that? How would you, do you plan for that? Or does it sort of start to develop and you go back and change things to fit those details that you want to put in?
So the question is about the various mysteries and puzzles, and how does one go about, creating that. I think the thing that's always important for me is it isn't just a treasure hunt or a crossword puzzle. These mysteries and clues and connections come out of the characters themselves. They come out of the narratives. So a little example is that very final passage that I read. I mean, it's very simple. It's a little girl talking to her therapist. But it's actually complicated because she doesn't even hear herself say, "Did his love flash before his eyes?" We have to begin to figure out that her experience of that moment is actually not correct, and we have to learn about it through the other character that she's also viewing. So it's not a formal puzzle or a formal mystery, but it already kind of has hidden something that a reader has to kind of clue into quickly, that there's a scene that just took place that isn't the scene that was represented here. And what I think is true is that happens all the time to us. We have, certain experiences that we construct narratives, around, and we are convinced that this is what we did today, or this was our, this is what happened. But in fact, they can be very, very different. So just by beginning to explore close up how we really navigate a subjective world that also contains very objective truths. It's complicated, but it gives rise to all sorts of mysteries and whatnot. And out of that, yes, there's a revision. You can go back and you can start, that's part of the craft. But there's also being sort of aware of how the story is unfolding and what these characters are telling you. And I think that's the other thing too, is that I spend so long with these characters that they begin to have the force of their own personality. So they begin to tell me what their mysteries are or what their puzzlements are, and then that becomes part of the texture and I guess even foundation of the work. Yes?
I'm wondering if there's a significance to choosing 27 volumes. What made you settle on that number?
The question is about whether or not 27 is significant. It's very, very significant. I'm really not going to comment on the number itself. It's a great question. It's a lot like, why is House blue? And it's also another great question, but it is part of the unfolding story. So we'll have to, I know many of the reasons why it's 27, but we'll have to discover together that particular significance. I see 2 hands raised in the back. 4. But no questions.
You want to ask him first?
Oh, you, sorry. I really thought the way I was looking was oh, there's a mirror. Is it?
It's a mirror.
I see. I know, I was like, he's got his back to me. Maybe he's taking a picture of himself, Now you see how blindly I hear the world and how deafly I see it. Yes?
Of everything you've read, is there anything that stands out as something you most wish that you had written?
Oh, everything that I've read, is there anything that I wished I could have written? I'm really, this is a more recent passion, but I'm really taken by the haikuist Basho. And it's not necessarily about a particular set of lines, though there are many, but I don't know if I would say I wish I would write them, because I think writing is so intimate that it's the same as saying, do I wish I were Basho? And so the answer is no. There's no one I wish I were. I have accepted my own fate of being the person I am. But I admire the minimalist spirit. I admire the commitment to the fleeting. And it's absolutely, it's polar opposite to what I'm doing now. So maybe that's why I feel like I have this enduring friendship with a man who lived, in the 1400s, because it's a glimpse of a completely different kind of voice, a different kind of way of writing. And he was also writing at the same time that Shakespeare was writing, which is sort of interesting, because there was, so it also makes me wonder about cultures. Do cultures demand larger architects or architecture? And am I just a product of that, culture that demands these far-reaching, struggles with the future, I guess.
Over here.
Oh, I don't know. That was awful bossy, but we'll go with her and then you, okay? All right.
I wanted to ask about the House of Leaves. There are so many very well-developed characters in this book. It's almost like it has 3 main characters with Johnny and Jameson.
Right.
And I was wondering if there was a character that was you were fond and watched develop, or one that was a little heartbreaking.
Can you say it a little louder?
Any characters in House of Leaves that were your favorite to watch develop, or maybe particularly heartbreaking to write?
So the question was about House of Leaves and its many characters, and were there any that I was particularly close to? I certainly was close to all of them. And did I have a favorite? I would they're like my children, so I would never pick one over the other. Certainly, Pelafina was one of the more powerful ones. I mean, sometimes characters just arise fully formed, and she was this kind of ghost who I know was always part of House of Leaves and was inhabiting it. But she came to me swiftly. And actually, a good little story, again, for writers. There's a lot about writing, getting back to the question of routine, is just about routine. It's being committed to that. And I have my Jane Goodall story about creativity. Has anyone heard this one? Yes, a couple? All right, well, I'll still tell it. So basically, in order to create, you got to go into the jungle, and you got to sit there, and you got to sit there in the same place. And you got to do it at the same time for the same amount of time, and you have to do it every single day. And if you're committed to this, eventually, you're going to start to hear sounds in the jungle, and then suddenly those sounds are going to have forms, and eventually the chimpanzees are going to come closer, and they're going to begin to tell you the story of the jungle, of themselves, and all you have to do is write it down. But if you don't show up, or you show up late, or you miss a couple of days, the chimpanzees are going to come and throw shit at you. So I am committed to this, and I remember this about Pelafina, and I forgot. I got really sick. I think it was a stomach flu or something, and I really couldn't write. And I realized, I have to keep writing. That's my promise to this story. And I remember just being in bed, barely able to lift my head. I couldn't go to my computer, and I had a clipboard with paper, and I just sharpened a lot of pencils. And I just basically said, I'm going to write 3 pencils a day. I would just until they were, not all the way sharpened down, but just until they were too dull to write. And in the beginning, I kind of didn't know what I was writing. I was so ill that I was just kind of I'm just going to write it, and it's okay if I throw it out. This is a different kind of exercise. But she found me, and then the illness quickly faded, and I wrote everything, all those letters out with pencil. And so she's still very close. Yes, sir?
When you read or hear NPR say that you basically killed the novel as far as...
That's right. Uh-huh. Direct quote.
You just answered my question because I just wonder what your reaction is. I mean, did you set out to be a murderer?
This guy's great. Did I set out to be a murderer? Gosh, that's a great one. Yes, I trained hard. What is all of that about? And you're starting to see it if you're following this, the kind of reviews that are being written, the kind of disparity between one media and another, the way people can be, if it's happening on Twitter or Facebook versus if it's happening on NPR or the Times. And I think it's the area that I'm attempting to become more compassionate in, because I not only know this book intimately, but I know all of it. And in some ways it's a little difficult to talk about because I'm kind of thinking about a moment that happens in volume 11, or, in 17 or in 5. But anyone who's reading this is not aware of all of that. But the question I think that they're really getting at with these, hyperbolic, ridiculous titles, by the way, it's kind of quaint, because the story of is the novel dead, or you're killing the novel, this is one of those things that's raged around, in Russian tea houses and colonial America. I mean, it just, it's always been around, killing of a form. You could just see that. Anyway, so I think the question is, and maybe you can share some of your insights in the time ahead, is how to talk about this book, in to me it's simple, but I realize it's hard to talk about. Like, it's amazing how many sort of comments are blind to even what it looks like. You know, it's just, some get into that. So I think it's just a really difficult creature to kind of hold on to. So then they just say, well, it's not a novel, so then he's killing the novel, and and then they get a little crazy. But it's okay. I kind of just petered out, didn't it? But that happens. Yes.
My question is about the fragmented storylines that you created in this first volume. Was that something that came naturally, that characters kind of tell their stories in fragments and you put them together the way they come, or is it more purposeful?
The question is about how purposeful the fragmented stories are. I don't know how I feel about the word fragment. I'm going to have to sit with that, but I think it's legitimate. I think, House of Leaves is basically looking at the film, a documentary movie, and it pays attention to that language, to that criticism, to that form, to the techniques that are within filmmaking. And Only Revolutions is all about music. It pays attention to composition, it pays attention to harmonies, to the ways things play off of each other in different kind of symmetries. And The 50-Year Sword is very much about the campfire story and how we tell oral tales, and we become kind of deaf to the multiple voices that inhabit those tales. And The Familiar, not the very beginning, but sort of later on I began to see it as this long-form television series, so that every 5 volumes constitutes one season. And even when the book deal was being put together with my publisher, we discussed it in terms of seasons. Well, maybe we'll try 1 season or 2 seasons. And so with that in mind, then it began to sort of, that form helped kind of form The Familiar, so that it even begins with kind of like Hulu, choose your advertising experience option at the beginning, or, and it's broken down into acts. And as you know, television does frequently move from different characters, whether it's Game of Thrones or Mad Men or, The Wire. And so that felt very natural to me. The other thing is I always knew there was going to be 9 characters, or at least an array. And I knew I wasn't going to tell them, I wasn't going to tell one story and then tell another, that I would sort of be going back and forth between them. And but by the time I reached the 10th volume, I began to understand all of its chapter structures, and that there were sort of 5 acts, and there's 6 chapters per act, and there's certain kind of other elements that are at work. And then, but that was also kind of chosen because that's the way the characters moved in and out of the storyline. And actually, a few people were telling me this who'd read it, that they began to kind of feel when you would get a Xanther chapter. Like the Xanther chapter would end, and then there'd be like this pause, and you'd be reading along, and then you'd suddenly go like, okay, wait a minute, where? And then she would sort of appear. So there was a lot of work that went into that. Yes. Yes.
I'm going to kind of follow up on a question that was before. Do you feel like maybe, as opposed to being the killer of the novel, that maybe you were a savior of the art form? Because I have lots of ebooks.
I love Tulsa, by the way.
I love ebooks, but I still love the book that I can hold and touch and even smell. And your books seem to be so artful and even tactile. When you were writing these, did you have some idea that maybe you were helping to preserve what it could be a dying art form?
So the question is, let me repeat this. Are you the savior of a dying art form? No, you couldn't hear that? Let me repeat it again. Thank you, actually, for the question. It's not it's not like it's a goal. I love technology. I'm fascinated by that reading experience. You know, I own an iPad. I've checked out other platforms. I accept that it may be an age thing. I was raised reading books, so I'm familiar with how to move through pages quickly. But I also know that one of the things that's missing, and I think it may actually be a corporate cultural problem, is that there really wasn't enough respect for books on the campuses of Apple and probably Google and whatnot. Because one of the things that a lot of readers do is they mark up their books. They bring them to life with their own life. And I tried doing that on a couple of e-versions, and there was a glitch, and it lost all the notes. And I said, well, that's done, you know. But I can return to Brothers Karamazov, and I can see like several readings, and the notes are all very kind of different. And actually, I heard that a friend of mine was working on a movie that's coming out soon called The End of the Tour, I think, about David Foster Wallace, and so they were, they were working on that, and apparently, and I had met David a few times because we were talking about if I was going to teach Pomona, and he apparently had a copy of House of Leaves, which he never admitted to me, and it was heavily annotated, and my friend actually got to see that. So that's kind of an exciting moment, you know, like that book then has a whole other kind of life. But I think the reason this book is the way it is, and all my books, is just that I love the book. So I'm constantly thinking like, well, what if we do this, and how do we do this, and oh, that makes sense. And I think maybe that's why it becomes this form that is very difficult to reproduce, you know, in an e-version, is just that, you know, it's maximizing a potential that's always been there, but for some reason, people have been really resistant to explore.
We'll do one more question on the side books.
Let's do two. I mean, that's kind of a little abrupt. All right. Yes.
I was just wondering, whenever you wrote House of Leaves, you kind of planned for it to be like interpreted by held by the person itself. Like if they interpreted it a different way than maybe how you were thinking it, but that's kind of okay. You know, if they read something else for them, as opposed to what it maybe originally meant to you whenever you're writing it. I just wondering if you're kind of in the eye of the beholder.
The question is about how I respond to the various interpretations of House of Leaves, right? I mean, there was a lot, because I'd spent 10 years on House of Leaves, I also anticipated an enormous amount of interpretation. So I've rarely been surprised by an interpretation of House of Leaves. But I also know that people do have their theories and whatnot. And I think the thing is about that house is that it ultimately ends up, when someone starts telling me about the house, they're really telling me about themselves, you know? And I actually was, here's one.